If a person is going to be saved, that person has to believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Did you get that? If you want to be saved, you have to believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now, I run into people and they say, oh, I believe in Jesus. Believing in Jesus doesn't get a person saved. Believing that Jesus Christ rose from the dead does. Why? Because why did Jesus Christ live and die anyway? See, we need to understand that. I'm going to speak about you. I'm sure that you have sinned in your life. I know I've sinned in my life. And when we sin, that sin creates a debt. That sin needs to be paid for. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says, the wages of sin is death. And because of the sin on my life and the sin in your life, your judicial sentence before God would be that God would kill you and you would be dead forever. And what God did in His grace and mercy is He accepted a substitute for sin. Jesus Christ came and died in my place and in your place. Jesus Christ died in our place. But if He hadn't died, then no one could be saved because the debt of sin would never have been paid. But is Jesus Christ dead and in the ground? Is that what happened to Him? No. Thank God. God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. If we listen carefully to the verse about salvation in the Bible, we'll see this. It says, this is Romans 10:9, by the way, that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you'll be saved. So you've got to confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord. That's easy. He's raised from the dead. He's Lord. He's Lord. Okay. But God raised Him from the dead and you'll be saved. Now, is that so hard to believe? I mean, realistically, is it so hard to believe that God raised Jesus Christ from the dead? No. It's not hard to believe at all. Let's take a look at some of the reasons why you and I can believe that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. First of all, let me say that no reputable scholar that I'm aware of, no reputable historian, doubts that Jesus Christ lived as a historical figure, just like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. You know, Jesus Christ lived. He was a historical figure. Okay, if He lived and He was the foundation and start of the Christian religion, then something happened to Him. I mean, how did He die? How did He leave planet Earth? Well, then the historians tell us that, okay, Jesus Christ was arrested by the Romans and He was killed. Great, so He died. The Bible tells us that His death was sacrificial for our sin. Now He's put in the ground. Now what about the resurrection? Again, no reputable historian that I'm aware of believes that Jesus Christ just rotted in the ground. That His body just rotted in the ground. Usually, in fact, they don't talk about what happened to His body because the evidence for a resurrection is pretty clear. I mean, first of all, what could have happened to the body? Here you've got this historical man who died. He's now in a tomb. What happened to the body? Okay, maybe his enemies came and took it. Well, no. His enemies wouldn't have taken the body. Why? Because His enemies were desperately trying to prove that He didn't rise from the dead. Because that was the claim of all the Christians, that He rose from the dead. And if the enemies had the body, you know what they would have done with it? They would have paraded it around. They would have put the kibosh on Christianity right away by saying, look, you're saying that you're starting this religion because your man Jesus was raised from the dead. Here's His body. He's not, okay? We're done here. His enemies didn't steal the body from the grave because if they had it, they'd have paraded it around. Would His friends have taken the body? No. These were honest, simple, most of them Jewish fishermen. They were God-loving people. They loved the Bible. They loved Jesus because they thought He was the promised Messiah. If they didn't think He was the promised Messiah, if He was just a dead guy in a tomb, would they have gotten together behind closed doors and say, hey, we can use this as an opportunity to start a brand new religion? They were honest fishermen. They weren't liars. They weren't storytellers. They weren't trying to fabricate a story. In fact, if you remember, when He died, they were all shocked and they were going to call it a day and go home. Gosh, guess we were wrong about this guy. So what's the third possibility? The third possibility is God got Him up from the dead. Yeah, and that's the one that really fits. Also, Jesus Christ could only have gotten out of the tomb by resurrection. Remember that that up until the time of the earthquake, when Jesus Christ was raised, there was a guard, an official guard, and the tomb was sealed. Nobody could have come and taken the body. And then when the disciples finally did show up, the tomb was already open, and the body was gone. The tomb was empty. So nobody came and took the body. It had to get out of the tomb by resurrection. Then you have the unified witnesses of resurrection. Now these are ancient witnesses. People say, well, it's just the Bible. But excuse me, the Bible is a historically reliable ancient witness. And when you read about it, you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John, all talk about the resurrection. Peter, the Apostle Paul, all talk about the resurrection. All have met Jesus Christ. Resurrection appearances to Mary Magdalene, other women, Peter, the men on the road to Emmaus, the 11 disciples, to the 12 a week later, to 7 disciples by the Sea of Galilee, to 500 believers at once, says about 500 believers at once, says 1 Corinthians 15:6, to James, to the 12 at the Ascension. You know, if you had this many eyewitnesses in a courtroom, we'd be done. You know, nobody would say, wow, all these eyewitnesses are wrong. This is not fabricated material. Then you have to deal with the unbelief of the apostles. If you remember from reading the historical records, that the apostles, even when, for example, the women came back and said, wow, we've seen him, he's raised from the dead. What? The resurrection of Christ was such a bizarre concept to them. It was outside of their 9 dots. They didn't even believe it. Fabricate it. They didn't even believe it. Why would they fabricate something that they themselves didn't even believe? That would make no sense at all. You've got this powerful eyewitness testimony, the testimony of the empty tomb, and the fact that all the disciples and people who met Jesus immediately changed their minds about the resurrection of Christ. These are things upon which historical facts are based. You know, these are stronger historical facts than we have for a lot of Greek and Roman history. You bet. Then you have things like the testimony of the women. Now here's an interesting piece of evidence, because in the Greco-Roman world, the testimony of women was not even valued. In fact, if a man did something and was only witnessed by women, he could not be convicted on their testimony. Women were not considered believable in the ancient world. And so why would the gospel writers even bother to write that the women saw it and the women testified to it if they knew in their culture that it would only make them look stupid to say such a thing? The only reason for that is that that's really what happened. The women saw it, the women testified to it, and the men wrote down what happened to the women. And then the idea of Christ's new body, that Christ had a body. Remember, they were behind locked doors and Christ appeared and that kind of thing. That was a totally foreign concept. You can't read about a prophecy of the Messiah in the Old Testament that says, and the Messiah will have a brand new kind of body that we don't have, etc., etc. I mean, the disciples were scared, discouraged, simple men upon the death of Jesus Christ. They didn't sit around and say, okay, we're going to invent a resurrection, and then we're going to invent that women talked about it, and then somehow or other we're going to get the tomb empty. We haven't figured that part out, but we'll figure it out. We'll get the tomb empty. And by the way, let's throw in that Christ had a new body, a new kind of body that nobody's ever thought of before. They wouldn't have done that. The only good explanation for what we read in the gospel record about Christ's new body is that it's what they saw, what they experienced, and they wrote it down. In fact, the very existence and growth of the Christian church makes no sense if Christ wasn't raised, because those early Christians suffered terribly. They were tortured, they were killed because of their belief. And if their belief was a hoax and they just said, well, I know we'll be tortured and killed, but later on there'll be this great religion, that makes absolutely no sense. The only reliable testimony of the foundation of Christianity is that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, like the Gospels say. Believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Confess him as your Lord. Enjoy eternal life as a Christian. God bless.
Some days I forget that I'm free, and sometimes my feet don't wanna carry me, but I just remember what you went through, and I'm gonna praise you.